Quinoa, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Frank Morton. Frank Morton runs Wild Garden Seed in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. He's been working with quinoa since the early 1980s and has grown out several, or a population of quinoa that's really done well for a lot of farmers in the Western United States, and that we've included in some of our field trials at WSU. And he's a really great guy and a fascinating speaker to listen to. So I'll turn it over to Frank, and I'm sure you'll very much enjoy his talk, as I will.
Thank you, Adam. I'm already wired. Thank you. No, these are not quinoa seeds. These are lettuce seeds. Lettuce is what I really know about. And I've worked with lettuce about as long as I've worked with quinoa, but lettuce is a lot easier to learn about. And it's way more familiar to me and to the people in North America than quinoa is. But I do talks like this frequently enough that I have a kind of a theme going, and the theme is, where do seeds come from? And when I say that, I could mean where they come from on any number of levels. Where they come from geographically, where they come from evolutionarily, where they come from commercially. There's a lot of ways to look at this question of where do seeds come from? Where do varieties of seeds come from? Who bred them? Was it a farmer? Was it a scientist? Was it a chef? So I just find this simple question interesting on a species by species basis. But today I'm here to talk about where my quinoa came from, not where quinoa came from. But when I'm working with quinoa, and I've worked with it since 1983, a very small garden scale kind of enterprise. I didn't know a thing about quinoa when I started growing quinoa, not a thing. I'd never eaten it. I had never seen the plant. I came across quinoa because I was actually looking for salad greens. And that's how I stumbled onto it. But in working with it over the years, I've been so impressed by how adaptive quinoa is. About how it, well, just the little bit I know about where it grows in South America and the different altitudes and latitudes and the different ecosystems and wet areas and dry areas. So I've always thought that quinoa, you know, just by its very nature, must be an extremely adaptive crop, which fits in nicely with this prejudice that I have, which is that the evolution of plants is largely all about the interaction of plants with other species, insects in particular. And when it comes to our agricultural plants, the main interacting species is us, is the farmer. And so I kind of think of my experience with quinoa in some small way as a recapitulation of what must have happened with quinoa all up and down the Andean mountain range, where the native forms of quinoa were interacting with the people in all these different locations, and the people had a general need for food, of course, but a lot of other things too. Cultural implications of quinoa must have directed its adaptation to some extent. Religious ideas about quinoa must have affected it. Political ideas, like the ones we're already hearing here, will affect the adaptation of quinoa wherever it does or does not go. So basically, I think that plants evolve in response to animals, whether the animals know what they're doing or not. Honeybees, bumblebees. The the evolutionary connection between them and the plants they work with is really deep. So the previous picture was basically a mixture of all the quinoas that I started working with, that I began working with in 1983. There were 3 varieties of quinoa available to me at that time. And they were the Colorado varieties that many people in this room are familiar with. I don't remember specifically all the numbers, and I don't remember anything about the traits of those numbered lines. But the numbers were 406, 407, and 409. And they were available to me through a little regional seed company called Abundant Life Seed Foundation that started in 1973, was based in Washington State in Port Townsend. And the purpose, the mission of Abundant Life Seed Foundation was to make seed collections of crops that would be appropriate to the Pacific Northwest. And they had things in their catalog that I had never heard of before. Arugula. Nobody I knew had heard of arugula in 1983. Amaranth, never heard of it. Red Russian kale, now a common item, but it first showed up in that little seed catalog. And that's where the quinoa first showed up for me. And over the years, basically all I have done is use mine own uninformed needs and tastes and eye to direct my program with quinoa, starting with that mixed population. It didn't take me any time at all to mix up those numbered lines. I lost track of them right away. It did not take any time at all for those 3 lines to become a population. And I should say that during the 1990s, a few other varieties came into that, Isluga and Temuco, and a couple others I don't remember. So what I'm doing in this picture is I am essentially organizing these plants on the basis of their qualities that I can see. The color of the head, the height of the plant, and whether it's branched or unbranched. And I am literally laying out my crop in a kind of a spectrum here so that I can see them. But when I first started working with quinoa, this is what I wanted. I wanted the greens because I was starting a salad business. And this salad business that, I dabbled in first in the autumn of 1983 would eventually become the business that bought my farm. My wife and I started selling salad greens first to Portland in the Seattle area. Eventually, we sold salad greens across the United States to fancy restaurants. And I was looking for everything you could eat raw. And one of the things I came across was quinoa. And as a substitute for spinach in the summertime, it worked great. So I wasn't interested in the grain. I was interested in the leaves. This is another Chenopodium. This is Chenopodium capitatum, which didn't have a common name, so I call it strawberry spinach. Because when it makes its seed, it has a seed head analogous to a quinoa, of course, except that all those little balls that hold the seed in the quinoa are a fleshy fruit in this plant. This is one of the only Chenopodiums that I have not crossed to quinoa. So starting with that first population, I began to pull out lines or multi-lines that I thought looked good as a seed head. And this was my first variety, cherry vanilla, I called it. I named most of my varieties for ice cream flavors. Because when I look at this, all I think of is ice cream cones, which shows you how different the associations are for me than for the people who actually domesticated this crop, you see. This was out of cherry vanilla. I pulled this one. I call this redhead. which I guess isn't an ice cream flavor, but whatever. Um, anyway, and redhead was the first thing that I grew as a pure line over and over again, enough that it had the experience of rain in Western Oregon. And as a consequence, I was able to reselect out of this for reduced head sprouting. The problem with growing quinoa in Oregon is if you get rain in August, like 48 hours of it, all the seed sprouts in the head. It has no dormancy. However, I shouldn't say all the seed sprouts. On 90% of the heads, the seed sprouted. On another 10% of the heads, they did not. And I found that in the next round of selection, 60% of the heads did not sprout. And so it really only took 3 rounds of selection for me to have a variety that can get wet for a couple of days without sprouting in the head. And this is a recent selection out of Cherry Vanilla, where I'm actually looking for, this is being grown in the valley, I should say, 5 miles away from where I live. I live in the foothills of the Coast Range, on the east side of the Coast Range, the dry side of the Coast Range. And I am reliably 5 to 10 degrees cooler day and night than the Willamette Valley, which is literally 5 miles away from me, 200 feet down in elevation. This plant that you're looking at doesn't have any seeds on it. It looks like it has seeds, but there are no seeds. And this is what I found, that when I came down off my mountain to the valley, I did not get reliable crops every year. And that was a mystery to me. This is the vanilla side. Once again, it looks stressed as well. And it's stressed by a combination actually of insects and temperature. And I'll get into the insects at the end. But my program right now is sort of focused on trying to find quinoas that will produce seed reliably in the Willamette Valley. This is the pool that I use to breed out of. I call this Brightest Brilliant Rainbow. And it is pretty much what it says. These would be a population that's been repeatedly selected for nice seed heads in Western Oregon with the brightest colored seed heads that I can select. It's an ornamental bent that I have for quinoa. But out of this, I have selected various colors and seed head shapes, including this. This would be the progenitor to Oro de Valle, which is this is the closest thing I have to a valley quinoa. It's still under selection. We're in the 3rd round of selection of growing it in the valley. And it's a beautiful plant. This is French vanilla, and this is growing up at my place in the hills. This was actually selected from an individual plant that it was a single plant growing in just a really hard, dry pathway where it never received any water and never received any attention, basically. And I noted that it was a completely branchless plant. So I saved the seeds from it and grew them out. And sure enough, when I grow these closely spaced, they're branchless, even though the population that they came from is very branchy. This is my latest variety, I guess, if you don't count this one. This is something new I'm working on. I call it mint vanilla. I'm not sure what to say about it. I like to look at it. I haven't really eaten it yet. I haven't had enough to eat. It may have a bunch of susceptibilities, like susceptibility to downy mildew. I'm not sure about that yet. But basically, just on the basis of a naive selection of these bright colored plants and using this as a base population, I have essentially been trying to select for things that work in my system. Now I want to talk about the introgressors. I've been growing this plant as long as I've been growing quinoa. This is what I call this purple goosefoot. It did not have a common name when I bought it. It's Chenopodium giganteum, which I gather comes from Europe. It was introduced to the US through a little tiny seed company called Pests Seeds around 1980, something like that. And this is now, I've been growing this since then. I've used it as a salad green in my salad mixes ever since the early 80s. And it has now been commercialized. It's being sold by Johnny's Selected Seeds in Maine as a commercial salad ingredient. Just so happens I provide them with the seed. This is the seed head of Chenopodium giganteum. And actually, this is a volunteer plant that has been growing in the area where I grow quinoa for some time. It's possible that this is actually an F1 between quinoa and Chenopodium giganteum. I'm not certain of that yet. I'm still learning about these things. This is a lamb's quarter here in the front. And once again, this is lamb's quarter that's been growing with my quinoa crops for some time. And I have seen crosses between quinoa and lamb's quarter. And in the past, I had thrown them away. But recently, I was over at the quinoa trials on the Olympic Peninsula with Kevin and Adam and Hannah last week, and I saw some of John McCammond's seed growing there. And I got the story that his native Chenopodiums there in the Rocky Mountains has probably contributed to the genetic diversity of White Mountain quinoa. And so suddenly I was thinking, well, I shouldn't be pulling those lamb's quarters out of there. I should be seeing what happens with those. So I won't be pulling those out and throwing them away anymore, probably. This is Chenopodium berlandii nutalii. That is to say, this is southern Wasant, I think is the common name. I believe this variety is called Red Aztec Spinach. I got this variety from Abundant Life Seed Foundation just a few months before they burned down, along with all their seed supply in Port Townsend, just about 10 years ago this week. Apparently their Wasant seed was getting old, and they asked me if I would grow that for them. So I took some of their seed and started a crop, little knowing that that would be the last Wasant seed ever taken out of their collection. So here it is. This is probably in October when the plants are approaching maturity. The seed head. The seeds are smaller than quinoa, just a little bit. And they have a little bit more of a seed coat on them. This is the Wasant seed. They're sort of a nut brown color. But they look remarkably like quinoa. So this year, I just happened to begin to notice the naturally occurring crosses between my Wasant and my quinoa. This is a small patch out in one of our seed production fields. That's cherry vanilla quinoa is in the beds closest to us. And directly upwind from that is up there. Oops, up there. Those are cherry vanilla crossed by Wasant. And I know that because I transplanted this crop. I transplant almost everything I grow for a number of reasons I'll get into in a bit. But these are transplanted quinoas and transplanted Wasant hybrids. And I could see in the flat which ones were the crosses. Looking at a flat of quinoa, the crosses stood up about 1.5 inches higher than all of the pure quinoas. And the stem was red. Well, not red, but redder than the quinoa stem. So it was clear that what I had here. I knew right away what it was as soon as I tuned into it. The plants on the left are the quinoa Wasant hybrid. The plants on the right is the pure quinoa. Hybrid vigor, for sure, is in effect. Those quinoa plants, the short ones, are probably being affected by a soil pest that we have called symphyllans. And you don't need to write that down because I think that the Willamette Valley is the only place that has symphyllans. But they are devastating to quinoa. They eat the root hairs off of it. And in our rows in the Willamette Valley, you can see the height of the quinoa go from this high down to this high in about that many feet. I have quinoas that top out this tall with seeds on them if they're being affected by symphyllans. And just 3 feet away, you can have a plant this tall that's not being affected by at all. So it may be that Wasant has some sort of a resistance to symphyllans. Wouldn't that be amazing? You can't tell, it's hard to tell the difference between the hybrid and the pure quinoa at this stage by looking at the seed head. But if you look at the stem, it's clear. This is a quinoa stem in my population, and this is the hybrid stem. Makes them very easy to pick out, way easier than looking at the leaves or the flowers. This would be that Wasant hybrid nearing maturity. You'll see the cherry vanilla is just barely peeking into the picture right here. So, and it's mature, such as it is. You can see the difference in the stature of the plant at maturity, though. This is the seed head of the Wasant or the quinoa Wasant hybrid. Those are not filled out yet. There's no seed that you can squeeze out of that yet. This picture was taken last week. And when you get right down inside the seed head, you can see that dark stem goes all the way through the plant. If I was opening up a quinoa seed head, those stems would be green. This is Wasant direct seeded. The previous pictures are transplanted. This was direct seeded. And you'll note we're using drip irrigation, by the way. Here. On the left is cherry vanilla, excuse me. On the left is French vanilla crossed by Wasant. And the plant, it's hard to pick out, I admit. The plant to the right of it would be the stature of the the French vanilla. So you can see the height of the plant from a direct seeded start is still different. You still see the hybrid vigor. The seed head of the hybrid, of the quinoa, and of pure Wasant at the same time. The Wasant is very late. It doesn't make seeds early, no matter how early you plant it. For me, Wasant will only make seed as a fall crop. That's the stem of the Wasant. Okay, so since I picked up on this, I'm kind of interested in it. And this picture was taken on Saturday, just this past weekend. These are specimens out of brightest brilliant, planted right down between rows of Wasant. And I will be saving seeds from each one of those individual quinoa heads to seek out, different genotypes of quinoa by Wasant. The pink colored plant is the Chenopodium giganteum. The plant right next to it, I believe, is a cross with quinoa. I believe that is a Chenopodium giganteum crossed by quinoa. These have just showed up in my nursery in the last 3 years, and they're everywhere. They look and act like a Chenopodium giganteum, but they've lost that pigment. And they're not quite as tall. See that? In this patch of cherry vanilla, the two plants that are looking out at you are cherry vanillas. The one in the middle, this plant right here, this seed head right here, I am virtually certain that that is a back cross with Chenopodium giganteum. The plants did not look the same as they were growing. That plant that I just showed you, it had a much smaller seed head to begin with. At the time when the cherry vanillas were really starting to form a seed head, the other one, the putative cross, had a much smaller seed head. And I was pretty sure that it was going to make a seed head full of black seeds. But it didn't. Instead, it made a very large seed head with branches that came up to the same height as the seed head, which I'm not used to seeing in my quinoas. And the seeds are perfectly white and thick. This plant is going to yield about twice as much as any plant around it. This is a neighboring seed head of cherry vanilla, just right beside it, compared to that. This is the stem of the putative hybrid. You'll see these tiny little red flecks on the stem, places like that, and right there, where it's been damaged by insects or maybe just being bumped. I'm pretty sure that this is the quinoa right beside it. You'll notice it does not have those little red marks on it. And this is a Chenopodium giganteum stem. It has that pigmentation in the notch, just like my putative hybrid. So anyway, I think I have a cross, if not a back cross, between Chenopodium giganteum and Chenopodium quinoa. Back to lamb's quarter for just a moment. I found this on Saturday walking through my quinoa patch. You look closely at the seeds poking out here. They look way bigger than a typical lamb's quarter in my garden. And the way they're exposed and poking out of their pericarp like that, I suspect that this might be a natural hybrid. In which case, this plant will have perfectly nicked, that is, pollinated simultaneously with my brightest brilliant population that this is growing with. So the seeds of this could be the beginning of my lamb's quarter quinoa breeding program, such as it is. Now the species interaction necessary here is really only bringing these two species close together. Right here is my Wasant patch. Here's my brightest brilliant patch. This is taken on Saturday. By the way, these brightest brilliant are about half the height that they were last year. which I think is related to planting time. It seems to me that the earlier I plant my quinoa, the shorter the plants are. Not necessarily the less yield, but less stem. Later, I'll show you some direct seeded plants that are about 3 times this high already, and they don't even have a seed head on them yet. Okay, this is my Wasant patch. And walking through it, I see this plant. This plant is not like any of the plants around it. This one right here. I am pretty sure that this is the first example I've seen in Wasant of quinoa crossing into the Wasant as opposed to the Wasant crossing into the quinoa. That putative hybrid is on the left. The Wasant plant is on the right. You see the difference in stature. That is, the Wasant is taller. You see it's way less mature. That is, it doesn't have any color yet. The seed, the florets and the immature seeds are larger than the Wasant. And this is its stem. This is the stem of the putative hybrid. That is the stem of the Wasant. I think I got one. So anyway, this is really it's not a very sophisticated breeding program, right? I'm just fooling around. But my seeds are going all over the world this year, so I guess I've gotten somewhere on that. Okay, so what are we trying to solve by breeding with quinoa in Western Oregon? Well, I originally thought the quinoa was a pest-free plant. That just shows that you haven't grown it very much. These are cucumber beetles, 9-spotted cucumber beetles. They love quinoa. That is a quinoa transplant right there. It also has flea beetles on it. You see the little black flea beetles? They're eating the quinoa too. If this had been a seedling, you would never have seen it. That is to say, if I had direct seeded this, you'd never see it. The cucumber beetles eat it off before it ever has true leaves. Another good reason to transplant. So this is the medicine for that. This is a mixture of, basically it's bentonite clay. It's surround. It's supposed to clog up the mouth parts of the beetle as they try to eat the leaf. I wish I could zoom in on this, but right there is a lygus bug. Lygus is what is keeping the Willamette Valley from growing quinoa seed. There is so much lygus there because we grow grass seed and hay. Nothing that lygus likes more than that, except maybe alfalfa. When the hay gets cut, or the grass seed gets cut, all the lygus moves into the green vegetation, which includes quinoa, and they can devastate the crop. This is a cherry vanilla head being grown in the Willamette Valley. It looks good. It looks like it's on its way to filling out and being going to be a nice head in a month or two. But I took this head and I banged it into a tote. And the tote was perfectly clean. All the little dots that you see in here are lygus bugs, and there's over 200 of them out of one head. So I tried to spray those out. I spent 2 weeks regularly spraying the patch. At the end of 2 weeks, I could not see I had done a thing, except probably killed a bunch of beneficial insects. One of the things that you notice when you're walking around with a spray bottle of Organic spraying quinoa heads is how many beneficial insects are on the quinoa. So as I was going through doing this, there were, of course, ladybugs, green lacewings, brown lacewings, minute pirate bugs. All of those are my friends. I don't want to have to spray quinoa to deal with lygus bugs. They're already full of a lot of beneficial insects. Those beneficial insects should be taking care of it, but they don't. So I think what we need is some sort of a genetic resistance to lygus bugs. This is downy mildew. Okay. Downy mildew. This is Chenobodium giganteum in the same location, no downy mildew. Aphids galore. And there seems to be an aggregating thing that happens with aphids that I'd like to talk to some of you experienced people about. I find one plant in the patch that's coated with black aphids, and I don't see any others. There are, of course, ladybugs, but as you can tell, it's way too late. Stress is something that I'm hoping that Wasant, heat stress, will help eliminate, or that Wasant will help the plants deal with heat stress. That picture and this picture are exactly the same strain, grown 5 miles apart. There's no stress here. These plants are full of seeds. These plants are empty. Weed pressure, water restriction. This is a completely unweeded patch. We transplanted in the cherry vanilla and did not weed the lamb's quarter, the Wasant, or the purple goosefoot, or the borage, or the kale, or anything out of it. But we still got a crop with no input after transplanting. This is the same strain transplanted, but with weeding and with water. Clearly, this has a higher yield with higher inputs. Direct seeded, see how tall they are? They don't necessarily make any seed heads on the top right to begin with. Wimpy little things. I'm out of time, so I'm clicking. One of the things I noticed about quinoa is it's so adaptive that if you direct seed it 4 inches apart and some of it doesn't come up, the plants that have the extra space will fill it with their branches. Fantastically adaptive crop. And what's terrific about this is that it shows that, well, with most plants, and certainly with quinoa, you don't really have to know exactly what you're doing, and I'm sure that the people who first domesticated it didn't know anything about the chromosome number of quinoa. It didn't keep them from adapting it to their purposes. All you have to do with quinoa, it seems, is to keep interacting with it. Keep talking to it, and it will work with you. Thank you.